Chris woke to the sound of a monitor screaming and the burn in his chest where the paddles had hit. And for a long second, he could not place the light above him, the smell of antiseptic, or the weight of the blanket on his legs, only that his mouth was dry as paper and his tongue felt too big. Then a man leaned over with a name tag and calm eyes and said, "You're safe, Mr. Harper. I'm Marcus. Try not to talk." And the word safe floated in the air like a thing that did not belong to him. So he closed his eyes and thought of Linda, his wife, and Mark, his son, the two people whose faces had filled his life for more than 70 years. And he tried to say their names, but only a rasp came out that hurt his throat. And Marcus put a hand on his shoulder and said they had called family, and he should rest. The hours slid past in a slow gray line. Machines clicked and hissed. Shoes squeaked on the polished floor. Someone laughed too loud at a joke down the hall, then went quiet when a door closed. And when the lights dimmed for night and the ward softened to a hum, Chris heard a voice near his bed, a careful whisper meant to be private. Marcus on the phone saying, "Yes, ma'am. He's stable now? Yes, conscious? Would you like to speak to him?" Followed by a pause that felt like an open elevator shaft. Then a low, "Okay, I understand." And the call ended. And Chris lay still with his eyes open to the ceiling and thought about the question, would you like to speak to him? And how you do not ask a question like that unless the answer is no. And the no slid into his chest and sat there heavy and cold. In the morning, a nurse came with a new water cup and a cart of supplies and wiped the tray and straightened the blanket. And when she lifted the cup again, a folded piece of lined paper showed under it, as if someone had left it there fast. And Chris reached for it with hands that shook and unfolded it and read, "Gone for 10 days. Hope you feel better when we return. L&M." And that was all. No phone number, no time, no promise, just words that sounded like a note you stick to a fridge before leaving for a lake house. And he waited for tears that did not come, because there was only a kind of quiet so thick he could hear his own blood. The doctors said he had a small heart attack, but they had brought him back, and he was lucky. They said he would recover if he rested and took his pills. They said they had called his wife again and left messages, and the days blurred together in a slow rhythm of checks and pills and short walks to the door and back. The fake sunrise on the wall clock, the TV in the next room telling the weather in a voice that made everything sound normal. And at night, he folded the note and slid it under his pillow and took it out and read it again, because he could not stop trying to see if the letters meant something else. If L&M stood for love and mercy and not Linda and Mark, but the lines were plain. On the 9th morning, a volunteer with kind hands and a vest with a badge wheeled him past the nurse's station to the loading zone, handed him a brown bag of medicines and a copy of the discharge sheet, and asked if he needed help into the van. And he said he was fine. And the driver asked his address, and they drove south through Salt Lake City, where the mountains wore snow like white caps, and the air had that clear winter taste. And Chris watched the same streets he had driven for years pass by like a film he had seen too many times. And he tried not to think of the phone call and the note, but they rode with him anyway. When the van pulled up to his small brick house in Sugar House, he knew something was wrong before the engine even stopped. Because the curtains in the front window were not the plain cream ones Linda had liked, but a darker color, and the two metal chairs he kept on the porch were gone. And the porch looked bare in a way that made his skin itch, so he reached for the ceramic trout planter by the steps, the one that always hid a spare key tucked in dirt, and found only dry soil and a smooth, empty space. And he stood there longer than he should have, with the wind lifting the edge of his coat, then tried the doorbell, then knocked with the flat of his hand, then looked up and down the quiet street where a dog barked behind a fence and a delivery truck idled at a corner. And after a while, he went around to the side gate and found it latched with a new lock. And he went back to the front and knocked again and pressed his ear to the wood, and his heart thudded in a slow, stubborn beat that reminded him not to be foolish. A neighbor across the street opened his garage and looked at him once, and then away like neighbors do when they want to stay out of something. And Chris decided he would not stand outside his own house like a man who had wandered to the wrong address. So he walked to the kitchen window, where the old screen never sat quite right, and pushed at the bottom corner, felt it give, lifted it, and eased the window up enough to reach in and flip the latch. And then he was inside his kitchen, with its clean counters and the faint lemon smell Linda liked to leave behind. Except that the lemon was too strong, and the counters looked staged, and the chairs were moved, and the pictures on the wall were gone. But for the nail holes, and there on the table was a glossy sheet on thick paper that reflected the winter light. Charming East Bench home, ideal for young families, with his front door right there in the photo, and his maple table beneath a vase of flowers that were not his, and his throat tightened until he had to put a hand on the back of a chair to steady himself. He moved into the living room and found a cardboard box that held frames face down, and when he turned one over, he saw his wedding photo slipped behind a couch cushion print, like someone had packed in a rush. And on the counter, a manila folder lay open with copies of a document he knew, by the way his stomach dipped before his mind caught up, his own signature at the bottom with a date from 3 years ago, the week after his knee surgery, when Linda said he should sign the insurance stuff and rest, and his name on the lines that said power of attorney. And he read the parts he could in his slow, careful way, seeing words like authority, manage, assets, and thinking about how heavy a pen had felt when his leg throbbed and the pills made his head light, and how he had trusted the hand that guided his hand. And a question rose in him, not loud, just steady. Was this all a plan? Or did the plan grow after the paper was signed? And how long had he been a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved? He stood in the quiet house that now felt like a set and listened to the furnace click on and the monitor in his head click off. And for the first time since the paddles burned him back, he felt the shape of a decision take form. Not a wild thing, not a shout, but a simple thought he could hold. If they had space for a vacation while he stared at the ceiling, if they had space for flyers and fresh paint and locks, then he would make space for himself. And he would do it step by step so he did not fall. And he would start by taking a breath and sitting down at his own table and looking at every page in that folder until the story written in neat legal lines stopped being a mystery only to the people around him and became a map he could follow forward. Chris sat at the maple table and pulled the manila folder closer, smoothing the creased edge with his palm the way he used to smooth lumber before a cut. And he read each page slow, lips moving on the legal words until they gave up their meaning. The power of attorney. Linda had called insurance paper after his knee surgery, dated 3 years back, gave her authority for medical decisions and limited financial management. But it never said anything about selling a house or changing locks or staging a room with flowers he didn't own. His own signature stared up at him in a shaky line that looked like it had been drawn by a man blinking away anesthesia, and he tried to remember the day, the smell of broth in a foam cup. Linda's hand on the clipboard. The quiet, please sign here tone people use when they think they are doing you a favor. And he felt heat in his face that was not anger exactly, more like a warning light on a dashboard. He needed a phone, proof, a plan. And he found the charger in the junk drawer, plugged in his old flip, and while it woke up, he reached for the dusty iPad. Mark always left on the pantry shelf beside the flour and the broken mixer. Pressed the home button and guessed the passcode on his fourth try. Mark's high school football number twice. And the thing opened. Bright and thoughtless, spilling messages and photos across the glass like a drawer dumped onto a floor. And there it was, plain as snow. A thread with Linda titled Next Steps, another with an agent called Sloan, another with Mark, House. And when he scrolled, the stomach-dropping line found him as if he had been waiting to be caught. Mark writing, "He's old enough to take care of himself, Mom. We can't babysit forever." And Linda answering, "Once the house sells, we'll breathe. Assisted living will have routine. He'll be fine." And the word fine welded itself to his ribs in a way that made him reach for the water cup and his little white pill and sit very still until the thudding in his chest came back to normal. He took pictures of every page in the manila folder with the iPad camera, then screenshotted the messages and emailed them to himself at the old account he barely used. Because a copy meant safety, and he had learned long ago at the rail yard that paper goes missing when money is nearby. He dialed the number on the glossy flyer, listened to it ring into a cheerful voice that introduced herself as Sloan from Canyon Peak Realty, and said, steady as he could, "This is Chris Harper, the owner of the house on Elm, and I'm calling to say I did not authorize any listing, and no one is to enter this property." And there was a beat of silence that told him she had not expected him to be on the phone at all. Then, a fast tone about understanding and how it was only a coming soon, and how she had been told everything was in order, and how we only staged lightly, Mr. Harper. And he said, "Remove whatever you set down and send me your paperwork." And she promised to email, but sounded like she wanted to hang up and start dialing other people. And he let her go because the front doorknob jiggled at that moment, and a key tried itself and failed, and a fist tapped the wood. And Chris moved to the peephole and saw a young man in paint-spattered jeans holding a bucket and a roller. And he opened the door only as far as the chain let it, and said, "House is occupied." And the young man blinked and said, "Linda told me to finish the accent wall today." And Chris said, "Not today." And the young man looked at the chain and the old man and the bucket and decided this was above his pay grade. So he left a card with his first name, Troy, and a number and a shrug, and he backed down the porch steps like a cat leaving a room it should not have entered. When it was quiet again, Chris looked at the deadbolt and knew what had to happen next. So he made a list on the back of an envelope: locks, mailbox, camera, lawyer, bank, and underlined lawyer twice because he knew he could not do this with stubbornness alone. He needed someone who read those pages the way he read a tool manual. He searched his memory for a name that had not been used up by disappointment and found Ben Ortiz, the boy from the church scout troop who had worked the rope knots until his fingers were raw, and who had later sent a Christmas card from law school in Ogden with a note that said, "Thank you for teaching me patience." And Chris typed, "Ben Ortiz, Attorney Ogden," with 2 fingers, and there it was, a small website with a picture of Ben grown and serious. So he called, and a receptionist said, "Ortiz Law." And then, after a pause and a transfer, Ben's voice came on warm and surprised. "Mr. Harper? Is that really you?" And the relief that came from being remembered by someone who did not want anything from him at that second almost made Chris sit down too fast. He told the story in plain lines: the ICU, the note, the flyer, the POA, the messages. And Ben did not rush him, only asked the kinds of questions that made the picture clearer, and finally said, "Bring the documents. Don't sign a thing. Don't let anyone in. If that POA is medical and limited finance only, they can't sell your house. I'll file to suspend and rescind it. We can get a quick hearing. Today, if the clerk is kind." And Chris felt the gears inside him mesh with the plan like a good latch finding a strike plate. He put the papers in a grocery bag because the old briefcase's latch was bent, added the iPad and his notebook of passwords, and pulled the shoebox from the hall closet where he had tucked extra cash and his father's railroad watch. And he slid the watch into his pocket for no reason but that it had weight and history and was not going to be left behind again. At the hardware store, he bought a new deadbolt, a hasp for the side gate, a mailbox lock, and a small camera doorbell that the clerk said was simple enough even for my dad. And Chris smiled and said nothing because he did not want to explain that he had been someone's dad for decades and still felt like a boy with a borrowed tool when the world shifted like this. Back home, he installed the locks slow, reading each instruction twice, and drilled new pilot holes for the hasp on the gate. And there was a moment when a passing car slowed in front of the house, and he felt the old fear press against his ribs. But the car moved on, and he set the camera to send alerts to the email he had just rediscovered. And he tested it 3 times until the chime sounded right. He called his bank and asked to speak to a manager, and when he had her on the line, he said he needed to freeze online access and remove anyone else's view of his accounts, and that he would come in person tomorrow with identification. And she said they could do that, and he wrote her name in his notebook and drew a box around it. By late afternoon, his hands shook from effort, But the house now answered to him again. A little, and he made a cup of tea and ate a slice of bread with butter because he did not trust his stomach. And he sat with the grocery bag of papers at his feet and the list on the table and felt the day settle into a shape that could be carried. As dusk came in through the window, he thought of Linda and Mark on some warm beach where the sand stuck to your calves and the drinks came with fruit skewers. And he let himself feel that picture for a count of 3, and then set it down because it did not help him make the next move, which was to sleep in the recliner with the bag beside him, and the new deadbolt clicked and the phone alarm set for early. And he whispered, not a prayer exactly, more like a line he would use to keep his mind from spinning. In the morning. Ogden? In the morning. The truth on paper. And he closed his eyes and listened to the furnace hum and the faint winter traffic and the new camera's tiny click as it saw the empty porch and told him, in its own way, that the night was his. Chris woke before the sun and moved like someone counting each step on a narrow bridge. He dressed, put the manila folder and the iPad and his notebook into a grocery bag, slipped his father's railroad watch into his pocket for courage, locked the blue door he had just rekeyed, and drove north toward Ogden with the heater on low and the roads clear but bright with cold. And when a small pinch ran across his chest, he pulled into a gas station, sat for 2 minutes with both hands on the wheel, took a pill, and waited until his breathing felt steady again. By 9, he was parking on a side street under a bare tree, crossing to a brick building where a modest sign said Ortiz Law above a bakery that smelled like cinnamon, and Ben himself opened the door before Chris could knock twice, older than the boy Chris remembered, but with the same careful eyes. And he said, "Mr. Harper, I'm glad you came," and led him into an office with a big wooden table and legal pads set out like tools. They spread the papers and the iPad between them, and Ben read quickly but not carelessly, his finger moving under lines the way a carpenter runs a finger along a cut to check it is clean. And he said, "This power of attorney is limited, Chris. Medical decisions and paying ordinary bills while you were recovering. Nothing about selling real estate. Nothing about transferring title. Nothing about changing locks." And he pointed to the notary block and asked, "Do you know this notary?" And Chris shook his head and answered that he only remembered Linda saying, "It's just insurance," and sliding the board under his hand. And Ben looked at the notary stamp again and said, "The address is interesting. It's the same suite number as a mailbox rental place next to Canyon Peak Realty." And he wrote the detail down because little facts like that can matter later. Then flipped to the listing printout and the agent's email header and said, "We will ask the court to suspend and rescind the POA immediately, and we will ask for a temporary restraining order to stop any sale or entry until a full hearing." And he took out a fresh pad and started making a list like Chris's list: petition, TRO, service, bank visit. And Chris felt relief and fear at the same time, because a plan meant movement, but also meant the problem was real. Ben dictated a short affidavit and asked Chris to tell the story in plain words for the record. And Chris did, from the monitor in the ICU to the note under the water cup, from the flyer on the table to the painter at the door. And he held himself steady when he said the line about Mark's message, "I'm old enough to take care of myself," because he knew if he let himself feel it full right, then he would not be able to sign neat letters on the sworn pages. They walked to the clerk's office 2 blocks away, took a number, waited on a plastic bench under humming lights, watched a couple argue softly about a parking ticket, and when their number flashed, Ben stood and smiled a professional smile and asked for an emergency hearing on a petition to suspend a POA due to overreach and health vulnerability. And the clerk, who had seen everything, glanced at Chris and then at the notary stamp and at the words "real property" that did not appear anywhere in the document, and said, "Judge Wilkes can see you at 1, and printed a small sheet with the courtroom. And they went back to the bakery and ate 2 bowls of soup, because the day would be long. And Ben sent emails with the filed petition and the draft TRO to Sloan at Canyon Peak Realty and to the general inbox for Canyon Peak and to the email Linda used for everything. And he also hired a process server named Kelsey to hand-deliver the papers to the brokerage and to Linda's house. because good notice is clean. And then they returned to the courthouse and sat outside a wooden door with a brass number until a bailiff opened it and said, "Ortiz?" And they went in. The judge listened without much expression, asked Chris two simple questions. Did you sign this document while under post-surgery medication? And did you ever tell anyone they could sell your house without you? And Chris said yes to the first and no to the second. And Ben showed the texts from the iPad and kept his voice even. And the judge signed the temporary restraining order and wrote a date for a full hearing 2 weeks away. And he said, no party shall enter or change possession or make any transfer pending further order. And he looked at Chris in a way that said he saw more than the case file. Then he nodded to the clerk to stamp the order. And suddenly, the paperwork had weight and the day had a new shape. Outside, Ben printed 2 copies at a copy shop and handed them to Chris and said, tape one to your door and one to your gate, and keep one in your pocket. And while they stood there, the iPad pinged, the new door camera catching motion. And Chris saw on the screen a man in a Canyon Peak vest stepping onto his porch with a key in hand and a clipboard tucked under his arm. And for a second, the old panic rose like a fast tide. But Ben pointed to the order and said, let's go. And they drove back to Sugar House, not talking much. Just the sound of the heater and tires and the iPad pinging again when the man tried the key and could not turn the new deadbolt. When they pulled up, the vest man was still there, knocking and looking at his phone. And Chris walked up the steps with the TRO in his hand and said through the door, this property is occupied, and there is a court order in place. Do not enter. And he slid the paper through the mail slot, and the man looked at it and at Chris through the glass and backed away like he had touched a hot stove. And he said, we were told. And Chris said, you were told wrong. And the man went to a car where a woman waited in the driver's seat with an expression like she was already drafting an email in her head. Chris taped 1 copy of the order to the door, and 1 to the gate, and a 3rd to the garage. Then he and Ben took pictures of each posting with timestamps because proof matters. And when the car finally pulled away, Ben said, good, and added, now the bank. And they drove to the branch where a manager named Miss Jensen took them into a small room with a glass wall and a plant that was trying to die. And Chris showed his ID and the court order and asked to remove all shared online access, to close any joint features, to set new passwords, to freeze outgoing transfers above a small amount unless he came in person. And Miss Jensen clicked and typed and printed and handed him a list of changes. And Chris signed in the boxes and wrote her name in his notebook and thanked her by name because that helps people remember to help you again. By late afternoon, he was back at the house alone, and the quiet of the rooms felt different, less like a stage and more like a place he could still control for a few days. And he made tea, ate a small sandwich, and walked the rooms slowly with the iPad set to record, opening drawers and cupboards to see what else had been moved. And he found a USPS redirection form, half filled in a stack near the fridge with his name written in Linda's quick hand, and the forward mail to blank still empty, which sent a small chill along his arms, because it meant someone had been in here thinking ahead to reroute even his letters. And he put the form in his grocery bag, and in the living room he noticed a fresh patch of paint on a wall that covered the pencil marks he had used to measure Mark's height as a boy, a small pale square where the years used to stand one above another. And he touched the edge of the square and felt anger rise and then lift, and he told himself out loud, this is only a wall, because saying it out loud made it more true. As evening came, he checked the camera feed again. Empty porch, a neighbor's cat, and he wrote 3 lines on a new page in his notebook. POA suspended, TRO posted, hearing set. And under that, because the day was not only papers, he wrote, breathe, sleep, do not answer the phone after dark. And he turned off the kitchen light and sat in the recliner with the grocery bag by his feet. And he let the mystery parts settle. The notary address that matched a mailbox place, the half-filled mail form, the way the painter knew a color choice he had never heard, and he understood he might never know every turn of how his life had been shifted while he lay under hospital lights. But he also understood the order of the next actions, and that, he told himself as he set the alarm for early again, was enough to carry him to morning. Chris woke to the pale winter light edging across the living room floor, and for the first time since the hospital, his next steps felt like a list he could carry in one hand. Take photos of everything, call Ben with updates, post the order, secure the mail, and trace the loose threads that still didn't make sense. He brewed weak coffee, set the iPad to record on the mantle, and moved slowly through the rooms with a yellow legal pad, writing down what was his and what had been moved. And it was only when he stood at the hallway wall that the quiet turned sharp. There, where pencil marks had once climbed in dates and inches, showing Mark's growth, a pale square of new paint covered the years like a bandage over an old wound. Neat, fresh, and wrong. He set his palm against it, half to test if it was dry, half to prove to himself the past could be erased with a tray and a roller. And he felt anger rise and then flatten into something clear. This wasn't just a sale. It was a rewrite. He spoke to Ben at 8:15, voice steady. Ben said service had been made on Canyon Peak and on Linda, that the restraining order was in force, that a hearing to rescind the POA outright would likely be set sooner if they filed an amended request citing health vulnerability and potential irreparable harm, which he would do by noon. It's not only about stopping a sale you didn't authorize, Ben said in his careful way. It's about making the record clean, so that if you choose to sell, it's your decision, not the debris of theirs. Chris liked that word, clean, so he read his list out loud and added 2 items: close the mailbox loop and find where that notary came from. He started with the mail, because if he had learned anything in 50 years at the yard and a lifetime of home repair, it was that problems often entered by the smallest door. He walked to the post office with the order folded in his pocket, waited in a line that smelled like winter coats, and asked the clerk to place a "do not forward without in-person authorization" note on his address. The clerk, a man with a tidy mustache and a calm way of answering that removed pride from the room, nodded, tapped keys, and printed a small receipt that looked like nothing and meant everything. On the way back, he stopped at the strip mall where Canyon Peak shared a wall with a shipping and mailbox store. The notary stamp on his POA had the exact suite number of that store, which sat under a faded awning between a nail salon and a payday place. Inside, a corkboard listed "Notary Hours, Mun Wed Fry 1 to 4." And on the counter, a woman with a long braid was taping a box shut. He asked as if he were thinking of notarizing a fishing club waiver when their notary had started. And she said, "Last year, after Christmas." And when he gestured to the board, she said, "Sometimes he does Saturdays if Canyon Peak has a rush. They send people over." And her face said she had already said too much, so he thanked her and bought 2 padded envelopes he didn't need so his visit wouldn't feel like a theft. On the way out, he noticed a stack of free real estate magazines and a glossy insert for Canyon Peak, with a photo of Sloan smiling at a kitchen island, and he took one because keeping paper meant not having to trust memory. Back home, the doorbell camera pinged. A man with a company polo set a small package at the step, took a photo, and left. And Chris felt again how many hands now touched the edges of his life without knowing him. Hands that would move on to the next porch and never remember the blue door. He brought the package in, opened it because it had his name, and found paint chips taped to a card with the words "Linda's short list, agreeable gray or sea salt," scribbled in her quick hand. And he put the card in a clear sleeve and slid it into the grocery bag with the POA and the half-filled USPS redirect form he had found, because stray papers make more sense when they can see each other. He called Sloan at Canyon Peak next, asking for their file on the property. She said there wasn't a file because there wasn't a listing, only a "coming soon." And he said, calm as a floor level, that he had a copy of the flyer and a video of their representative attempting entry after the restraining order. And there was a pause long enough to hear the soft click of someone choosing a lane. She promised to send an email confirming removal of any marketing and to speak with her broker. Within 10 minutes, an email arrived with language so careful it squeaked. "We regret any confusion. Our team was operating under the assumption we have removed any promotional materials. And at the bottom, in a footer, the broker's name matched a surname on the notary board. He did not know what that proved, except that a circle had been drawn around his house and people he did not know held pencils. When the iPad chimed again, it was a motion alert, followed by a knock he recognized not with his ears, but with a sense he did not know he still had. Mark's rhythm on wood, 3 quick taps, and a pause. And his hand went to the TRO on the door before his mind caught up. Through the peephole, Mark stood with his weight on one foot, like a boy told to wait at a threshold. But the boy was gone, and a man in a sharp coat stared at the order taped to the paint he'd once measured himself against. Chris did not open the door. He cracked a side window instead and said, "Read the paper." And Mark's mouth moved like he was starting in the middle of a sentence. "Dad, we didn't mean." And Chris said, "Do not finish that." And the words landed flat between them. Mark tried again, "Mom thought." And Chris said, "Mom can call Ben," and closed the window. For a quiet minute, nothing moved except a single brown leaf that had wintered too long. And then Mark stepped back, took a photo of the order with his phone, and left it at that for now. Chris sat at the table and felt the familiar thud of his heart, not as a threat, but as a metronome. He wrote on the pad, "They know I'm here. Do not talk without paper. Decide where to go." Ben called a half hour later with news. The court clerk had advanced the rescission hearing to the end of the week due to ongoing attempted interference, and Ben wanted Chris to gather any evidence of listing activity, mailed advertisements, or contractors' invoices. Chris said he had the paint chips, the USPS form, the flyer, and the camera clips. "Good," Ben said. "We'll make a clean record," then added, almost as an afterthought, "and think about what you want after the order is final. Stopping damage is one thing, and the rebuilding is another." The idea of rebuilding in the same rooms felt like trying to sleep in clothing fresh from a stranger's suitcase. So Chris stood, opened the hall closet, and pulled the shoebox with his father's watch and a decade of small important things. The title to the car, a birth certificate in a sleeve, 3 photographs that never made him sad. And he put the box on the table and looked at it as if it were a scale. On one side, the house he had painted and repaired and loved in the ways only a person who knows nails by length can love a place. On the other, the quiet of being left alone while the lights were bright and loud and the paddles burned him back. He did not need to argue with himself. He knew already. If he stayed, they would circle again. If he left, it would be on his terms. He called a number he found in an old notebook. A guy from church who now bought houses for cash explained he had clear title and needed a quick, clean close with no showings. The man said he could come tomorrow and make an offer that would not insult him. Chris said, "Bring a copy of your driver's license and proof of funds," and surprised himself with how practiced the words felt coming out of his mouth, like tools he had put away years ago but were still sharp. He then wrote 2 short notes, not to send yet, but to rehearse the feeling. One to Linda that said only, "Thank you for teaching me who you are," and one to Mark that said, "If you wish to speak one day, start by saying I'm sorry without a but." And he folded them once and put them in the shoebox. As evening dropped, he changed the side gate hasp he had installed the day before, printed 2 extra copies of the restraining order in case paper went missing. And then, because the mystery of the notary and the mailbox still itched, he drove back to the strip mall and sat in his car long enough to see a Canyon Peak assistant carry a stack of envelopes into the mailbox store and leave with a small key on a ring. When she drove away, he went in and bought a money order for no reason other than to see the counter close. And on the way out, he saw, taped to the corkboard beside the notary hours, an index card that read, "Mail forward forms must be signed in person with ID." A small rule that someone had tried to skip in his kitchen. He smiled for the first time in days, not because anything was funny, but because the world still had lines in it that could be followed. Back home, the house was quiet again, and the camera showed an empty porch. He cooked eggs in a small pan, ate them standing, washed the dish, turned off lights, made one last list for morning. Meet buyer, call Ben, retrieve medical records, pack only what matters. And sat in the recliner with the shoebox on his lap like a child with a lunch pail on the first day of school. He did not feel brave, and he did not feel old. He felt like a man who had decided, and that was enough to sleep. The next morning, the cash buyer arrived 5 minutes early, a tall man from Chris's old church named Nate, who parked a dusty pickup by the curb and walked up the path holding a folder and a thermos. And before they sat down, he set his driver's license and a bank letter on the maple table like a promise. His voice was plain and steady, the way men talk when they have hammered enough nails to know what can be fixed and what can't. And he said, "I pay cash. I close fast. I don't haggle a man who looks me in the eye." And Chris said, "No showings, no open house, no lockbox. No one comes in until the day you own it." And Nate nodded, as if he had already decided to agree. They walked the rooms without speaking much, Chris naming what would stay: the stove, the washer, a shelf he had built into a strange corner, and what would go in the trash. And Nate took notes and measured with his steps. And when they came back to the table, Nate laid out a simple one-page offer, as is: cash, 10-day close, and a price that was fair without being greedy. And Chris felt that careful click inside again, the one that told him the latch had found the strike. He called Ben on speaker so the words would sit in the room with them, and Ben asked 3 fast questions and then said, "I'll add language that recognizes the court order and confirms no access until recording. Send me photos of the IDs and the proof of funds. We'll open escrow at a title office I trust. You can sign this afternoon." And the day moved like a small river after a dam gave way, controlled but sure. Chris took pictures of the documents and texted them to Ben. Then he and Nate drove in separate cars to the title office on State Street, where a woman named Carly greeted Chris by name because Ben had already called ahead. And she ran a fast title search that came back clean because the POA had never been recorded against the deed, only sitting in a kitchen folder like a snake in a shoebox. And she slid a thin stack of papers across the counter with yellow flags to show where to sign. Chris signed his full name in neat letters that did not shake, and Carly said recording could happen as soon as funds arrived and the rescission order hit the docket. And Ben, on the phone again, said the rescission hearing was now advanced to Friday at 9 because the clerk did not like the smell of this. And Chris thanked him and wrote the time in his pocket notebook in block letters he could read without glasses. When they stepped back into the cold, Nate shook his hand and said, "We'll make it easy," and drove off, leaving Chris with the steady hum of cars and the sense that the house had already let go a little. He went to the bank next and sat with Miss Jensen again to open a new account with just his name and a low daily transfer limit, and he ordered 2 cashier's checks to replace the old balances he had moved the day before. And he bought a plain debit card that would arrive by mail, but he could still use an instant number for bills. And he wrote every change in the notebook like he was marking boards to cut. Old accounts closed, new account open, daily limit set, alerts on. From there, he drove to the phone store and paid cash for a basic flip with a new number, 2 months prepaid. And he told the clerk he preferred simple things because simple things break slower. Back at the house, he took the shoebox from the closet and sorted its contents on the table with the care a man uses when he cleans a gun. Birth certificate, social security card, car title, the railroad watch, 3 photos where everybody looked younger than they knew, a deed copy, and the letter drafts he had written the night before. He put the documents into clear sleeves and slid them into a thin black folder. Then tucked the watch and the photos back into the shoebox and put the shoebox by the door next to a small duffel he had found in the garage. He packed only what he could carry without stopping: 2 changes of clothes, the shaving kit, a blanket, his tool roll with the good screwdriver set, the notebook, the iPad, because proof lives in more than one place, and the paper bag of pills the hospital had given him. When he looked up, the blue door window showed the noon sky, and faintly, his own face like a man already leaving. The doorbell camera chimed and showed a white sedan creeping past, slowing, then pulling to the curb as if it were uncertain it had found the right house. And the driver's side opened, and Linda stepped out with a tote bag and sunglasses she did not remove. And she stood at the bottom of the steps without climbing them, and stared at the copy of the court order taped to the door like it was a sign written in a language she didn't speak. and Chris stood where she could not see him and watched her through the peephole. And when she finally knocked, it was a soft, practiced rhythm that used to mean, "Let me in. It's cold." And he did not open. He slid the side window a hand's breadth and said, "Legal notices through Ben." And she said, "It's me." And he said, "I know." And the space between the two words was bigger than their whole hallway had ever felt. And after a minute, she left the tote on the step and went back to the car and sat with her head in her hands, and then drove away. And Chris, after waiting long enough for the camera to ping, "No motion," brought the tote inside and found only a sweater he had once liked and a tin of cookies and a folded note that said, "We can talk when you're calm." And he put the note in the clear sleeve with the paint chips and the mail form, because the way a person writes can be evidence too. The afternoon slid into tasks. He canceled the newspaper, called the water company, set the electric to end the day after closing, printed a small forwarding card for the title office with a box address he rented under his full legal name because that was allowed, and he set 3 alarms for Friday's hearing. At 4, Ben texted a photo of the filed amended petition and a line, "Judge assigned, be there at 8:40, and Chris replied with a thumbs up because he did not have extra words left. At 5, Nate texted that funds were wired and escrow confirmed receipt. "We're on rails." And the phrase made Chris glance at his father's watch and think of tracks that crossed states without asking permission from anyone's weather. He made a simple dinner, eggs again, toast, a sliced apple, and he ate standing up because chairs felt too permanent now. Then washed the plate and put it in the drain rack and dried the counter because he had always left a clean kitchen for the morning. When the light went down, he wrote 2 short letters and addressed them but did not stamp them. One to Linda, the same 10 words, "Thank you for teaching me who you are." And one to Mark, "If you come to the hearing, come to listen, not to talk." And he placed both on the counter under a small river stone Evan had given him years ago, when Evan was only the neighbor boy with scraped knees, and he felt the small shock of that memory bloom and then pass. He slept in the recliner again, with the duffel packed, the shoebox beside it, and the black folder tucked under his arm like a book you do not lend. And he woke twice in the night to the camera ping, the neighbor's cat, a delivery truck, and once to a passing set of footsteps that did not stop, and each time he breathed slow and counted to 20, and the room settled. Friday came, and he wore his one good sweater and his winter coat, and arrived at the courthouse early enough to sit on the same bench as before. And when Judge Wilkes took the bench and looked over the papers and asked 2 more questions and read the amended petition, he signed the order to rescind the POA outright and to bar any future transfer under it, for cause shown. And his pen paused over the line like it was adding gravity, then moved on. And when the clerk stamped it, the sound was small and final, like a lid closing on a jar. Outside the courtroom, Ben smiled the first real smile of the week and said, "Now it is clean," and shook Chris's hand with both of his. And Chris said, "Thank you for showing up." And they both heard what that meant. By noon, the title office called to say they had the rescission on record and funds in escrow and could close Monday morning if both parties agreed. And Chris said yes, without asking anyone. And he walked home in the cold with the feeling that he was already lighter, that the house behind him was a shell with his shape in it for only 3 more sleeps. He spent the weekend stripping his life down to the smallest true things, shredding old bills, leaving the manuals in a neat stack for the next owner, taking the last cup hooks out of a door frame and filling the holes with a dab of paste so the wood would not look like it missed him. And on Monday, he sat at the title desk and signed the deed away. And Carly checked her screen and said, "Recording," and then recorded, and handed him a cashier's check and a copy of the deed with someone else's name on it. And Chris thanked her, slid the check into the black folder, and did not look back when he stepped into the blue air. At home, he propped the 2 letters on the empty counter, took one last quiet look at the pale square on the wall where the pencil marks had been, and said out loud, "This is only a wall." Then he locked the new deadbolt, tucked the keys for the next owners under the mat with a note that said welcome, picked up the duffel and the shoebox, and walked to the Corolla. He did not set a GPS because there are some roads he wanted to find by reading the land. And he drove south on I-15 until the valley opened and the Wasatch fell behind. And then he cut east on 6 toward Red Rock and Winter Sun. The shoebox seatbelted beside him like a small, loyal passenger, and the house with the blue door grew small in the mirror and then was gone. Chris drove until the Wasatch slipped into the rear window and the land opened to Red Rock and Winter Sun. Then he followed Highway 6 to a place he had never stopped before, a small town with a hand-painted sign that said Maple Creek, a good place to rest, and he took it as permission. He found a studio above a hardware store with a rusty stair and a door that stuck, and the landlord, a wiry man named Harlan, asked only 2 questions. You smoke? And cash or check? And when Chris answered no and cash, they shook hands and the room was his. A square of floor, a narrow bed, a hot plate, and a window that looked over Main Street, where a feed store truck came and went like a clock. He carried the shoebox and the duffel up the stairs, set the black folder under the pillow, and leaned the railroad watch on the sill as if it could keep time for him. Then he wrote the first line in a new notebook, printing slow, block letters that would be clear even if his hands shook later. My name in this town is Carl Winters, retired maintenance, widower, no children, Utah driver's license, same face, different number, new phone, 801, prepaid. Box address, Maple Creek USPS, key in left pocket. He read the lines twice and tucked the notebook under the pillow because he knew stories change when they live only in your head. In the morning, he walked with cash to the post office, rented a small box with a brass door, signed with the name on his new card, and told the clerk he wanted no forwarding requests honored unless he stood there in person. The clerk nodded like he had heard worse and slid him a key on a cheap ring. He bought a second mug and a small pan at the thrift store, and when the clerk said, "You just moving in?" he said, "Just passing through for a while." And the clerk said, "Aren't we all?" and wrapped the pan in old newsprint. He kept his first days simple: coffee, a walk, a list, and a job to make him visible in a useful way. He went to the library because shelves talked to him, and he asked the director, a woman with silver hair and a tidy sweater named Mrs. Hatch, if she needed anything fixed. She said, "If you can make the children's table stop squeaking, you will be a hero." And he slid to the floor with his good screwdriver and felt more like himself than he had in months. The way wood listens when you tighten it right. And when he stood up, the table held steady, and Mrs. Hatch smiled and said, "Mr. Winters, you are hired." And he answered, "Volunteer is fine." He fell into a rhythm. Mornings at the library, replacing a loose hinge or regluing a split spine. Afternoons walking the creek that gave the town its name. Evenings at the diner, where a woman named June poured coffee and called him Mr. Carl the second time he came in. June's grandson, Evan, came after school with a backpack too big for his shoulders and questions about everything. And one afternoon, Chris showed him a square knot with a length of bright rope and said, "Go slow. A good knot starts with patience." And Evan's grin hit him in the chest like a warm light he had forgotten he could stand in. He kept the other part of his life in order with quiet habits. He paid cash for groceries. He turned off his phone unless he needed to call the clinic to refill a prescription. He took his pills at the same time every day. He parked the Corolla 2 streets over so it did not sit under his window like a signature. He used the library computer only to check the bank balance linked to the new card and to read a train forum where no one knew him by name. When he felt the old ache spread across his chest, he sat on a bench by the creek, counted to 60 on an inhale and 60 on an exhale, and let the cold air tell him he was still here. He watched the town the way he had watched switchyards, the patterns that tell you what's normal and what isn't. The feed store truck at 9 and 4, the high school kids spilling past the diner at 3:15, the mail carrier's habit of skipping one cracked step on Harlan's stair, the single silver SUV with Utah plates that idled too long near the park one Tuesday and then did not come back, at least not that week. He wrote the details in the notebook with the plain care of a man who had learned the hard way that mysteries are just patterns you haven't named yet. Mrs. Hatch, widowed, 2 cats. June, night shift, good laugh. Evan, 8, likes rocks, asks why. Harlan, fair, cash only. No questions asked if you show up on time. One silver SUV, Utah plates, slow pass. 2:10 p.m. Could be nothing. He told no one about Linda or Mark. When people asked, he said he had worked maintenance at a big place in Salt Lake and retired because knees tell the truth. And no one pushed because small towns understand the value of leaving space around a person. The days began to fit together, a slow train with cars you could count, and the ache in his chest moved from sharp to dull like a bruise fading. He bought a used toolbox from Harlan's back room and paid by sweeping the stair and fixing a loose handrail. And he set the box by his bed, the way some men set a Bible. On the third Saturday, Mrs. Hatch asked if he could repair a bent shelf bracket before the children's reading hour. And he did. And when the parents came in, he stood back and watched the toddlers settle on the rug and surprise him with how loud joy can be without hurting your head. A blonde woman filmed a short clip on her phone of the kids laughing under paper streamers while a steady hand, his, set a basket of crayons on the table. And he did not notice the lens at all because he was busy making sure the basket did not tip. Later, at the diner, June slid a slice of pie across to him and said, "Evan's birthday is next week at the VFW room. Just hot dogs and soda and a cake his uncle will smuggle out of the bakery. Would you come? He'll want you to tie the pirate flag to the chair." And Chris felt the old reflex to say no because safety likes quiet rooms. But he also felt the smaller, new reflex that said yes because life likes witness. So he said, "I'll be there, and I'll bring a knot you can't shake loose." And June tapped the counter with the back of her spoon like applause. That night, he wrote 2 entries, accepted an invitation, bring rope, and call the clinic Monday for labs. Because building a new life means being brave and boring at the same time. On Monday, he kept the boring promise, a checkup with a PA at the small clinic on Main, a reminder to walk more, a note to keep the aspirin, a refill in a white bag he folded into his coat. On Wednesday, he kept the brave one. He walked into the VFW hall with a coil of rope in his pocket and a small wrapped book about rocks for Evan, and he stood by the wall while kids shouted and paper hats slid over their eyes. And a mom he didn't know said, "Smile, Mr. Carl." And he did, because the boy was happy, and because small moments can hold up a whole week when you let them. He slept that night with the railroad watch ticking on the sill and the notebook open to a blank page. And for the first time since he left the blue door, he did not write anything before lights out, because there was nothing to record but simple things. Hot dogs, a flag tied to a chair with a square knot, a boy laughing so hard he hiccuped, June leaning back against the counter at the end of her shift and saying, "You look like a grandpa today," and him answering, "Felt like one too." And both of them letting the words sit without fear. In the morning, Maple Creek looked the same as it had the day before. Feed truck at 9, kids at 3:15, mail carrier skipping the cracked stair. And Chris drank his coffee and thought maybe that was the working definition of peace. Ordinary patterns that don't ask you to beg for your place inside them. He did not know yet that the blonde woman had posted a 30-second clip of Evan's pirate flag and Mr. Carl helping him read the card, or that a stranger 2 towns over would recognize a face from an old church directory photo and start a thread for people who like to solve puzzles with other people's lives. He only knew that the rope knot held and the chair didn't tip, and the boy had been happy. And that was the last thing he wrote before the day turned and the mystery he had been careful to keep quiet stood up and said its name. It started 3 days after Evan's party, when June hurried into the library with her apron still on and her face pale under the bright lights, whispering, "Mr. Carl, you need to see this." And she showed him a 30-second video on her phone of Evan's pirate flag tied to a chair. Chris's hand steady on the knot while the boy laughed and tried to read the card. And under it, a caption someone else had written after reposting it. Found him. Utah grandpa who sold his house and vanished. New name, small town, and comments stacked fast beneath like cards in a shaky tower. Some kind, some cruel, some hungry for a story that was not theirs. He felt the room tilt for a moment, and then he sat at the small desk by the copier and opened his notebook and wrote 3 lines in slow, clear letters. Faces out. Do not panic. Keep the plan. And then he went back to tightening a loose hinge on the return slot because his hands worked better when they held a tool. That night in the studio, he switched the new phone off and laid the railroad watch on the sill and listened to Maple Creek breathe. The truck at the feed store, the last pair of teenagers laughing under the streetlight. Until his chest stopped feeling like it was full of broken glass. In the morning, the town was the same in the ways that mattered. But the internet was not. And by noon, a stranger, 2 towns over, had matched his face to an old church directory photo and posted a side-by-side with a headline that used the word abandoned, like a nail. And by evening, someone had found the Canyon Peak flyer image in a cache and spun a thread about family betrayal. And when June said, "People forget in a week," he nodded because she needed to say it. But he knew from switch yards and storms that once a train starts rolling, it does not stop because a man asks nicely. The second day, a silver SUV with Utah plates idled too long by the park and circled the block twice. And on the third afternoon, it slid into a space outside the library and sat there with the engine running until the driver shut it off and stepped out. And it was Mark, older in the face and heavier around the eyes, wearing a coat that tried too hard and holding nothing in his hands. Chris watched through the glass door for 5 long minutes, then walked out and let the door close softly behind him, and stood on the steps where anyone on Main Street could see them if they wanted, because hiding was a young man's habit, and he was done with it. Mark's mouth moved before his voice came. "Dad?" And his shoulders sagged on the single word like it had been heavy all the way from Salt Lake. And Chris kept his voice even and plain. "Read the sign." And he pointed to the paper posted inside the door with the library hours because it gave Mark something to look at that was not a face. Then he said, "Say what you came to say." And Mark said, "I'm sorry," fast, and then, "We didn't think." And Chris lifted a hand, not angry, just stopping a train on a short track, and said, "Do not put a but on the end of that." And they stood in the winter sun while cars rolled past and a boy on a bike did a slow circle because he understood that something important was happening, even if he did not know what. Mark tried again, slower. "I am sorry for not coming to the hospital, for the note, for the house, for saying you were old enough to take care of yourself." And the last part cracked his voice, and Chris nodded once to show he had heard the words. Not to forgive them, and he said, "You left me when I was weak and made plans over my head. I am alive anyway." And Mark said, "Can you come home?" And Chris said, "No." And the word felt like a smooth stone he had carried a long time and finally set down where it belonged. A few people pretended not to look as they passed, which is the kindest thing a small town can do. And Mark rubbed his hands together and said, "Mom is here. She's in the car. She's scared to see you." And Chris thought about hospital lights and a folded note under a water cup and a glossy flyer on his table and said, "She was not scared of paint chips." And Mark flinched and said nothing. Chris told him, "If you have something to send, use the P.O. box I will write for you." And he tore a corner from his notebook and printed the number and handed it across and did not let their fingers touch. And Mark took it like it might burn him and said, "Can we at least talk in private?" And Chris shook his head and said, "No rooms, no traps. If you want to see me, meet me tomorrow at noon by the creek bench, and we will each say one thing." And then he went back inside the library and mended a torn spine with clear glue and breathing that came easy again by the time the glue set. The next day, the sky over Maple Creek was clean and cold, and Chris went to the bench by the bend in the creek where the water made a soft sound like someone turning pages. And he sat with his hands folded and his coat buttoned to the throat and watched a hawk tilt in the pale light. And Mark came first, then Linda, walking a few steps behind him with a scarf wrapped tight and her mouth pressed thin the way it got when she wanted to control a room. And they stood on the gravel path and did not sit. And Chris stayed seated because he would not rise for a storm that had already passed. Linda spoke before the air could settle. "You humiliated us." And Chris did not answer it because you do not feed a thing you want to die. And Mark tried to fill the gap. "Mom, just..." And she waved him off and said to Chris, "You sold the house out from under me." And Chris said, "It was mine to sell." And she said, "After everything I did." And he said, "After everything I did." And they stood in the simple math of those sentences until the pride leaked out of them like air from a tire. Mark finally said his one thing, "I want to try again." And Chris gave him his one thing, "I hope you learn to show up." And then he stood because the terms were met and the meeting was over. And Linda said, "That's it?" And he said, "Yes," and stepped back onto the path. She reached out as if to touch his sleeve, then let her hand fall and said, "Very small. Are you happy?" And he thought of quiet mornings, of the children's table that no longer squeaked, of Evan's grin and June's easy laugh, of the railroad watch ticking on a sill that faced a street where no one knew the blue door. And he said, "I am not in pain," which was the truest answer he could give. And he walked away without looking back because he did not need to see their faces to know what they were doing with them. That evening, he wrote in his notebook, "Met by creek," said one thing each, "No rooms, door stays shut." And he closed the cover and set the book under his pillow and felt sleep come without the old fight. The internet kept turning him into a puzzle and then into a lesson and then into an argument. But Maple Creek kept its schedule. The feed truck at 9, the kids at 3:15, the mail carrier, skipping the cracked stair. And the diner kept a stool with a view of Maine where June poured coffee and did not ask for more than he could give. And Evan brought him a jar of small river stones for your shelf, Mr. Carl. And they stacked them into a little arch that held twice and held the third time. And he showed the boy how to check a joint for wobble. And the boy said, "Will it hold?" And Chris pressed the top stone once, twice, and said, "It will." And in the low window light, he believed himself. A week later, an envelope arrived at the P.O. box with Mark's slow handwriting, and inside was a single page with no excuses and one sentence that began and ended with, "I'm sorry." And Chris put it in a sleeve in the black folder and did not write back because some things needed time, the way knots need patience. And he went back to the library and fixed a bracket and said hello to Mrs. Hatch's cats and wiped a small smudge from the children's table and went on with his day. When the creek ran louder after a thaw, he stood on the bridge and listened to it talk in its old way. Keep moving. Find a clear channel. Do not let other people's debris make you change your course. And he touched the watch in his pocket and felt the steady tick that meant he was still here. And he walked home past the hardware store where Harlan was sweeping the step. And he raised a hand, and Harlan raised his back, and the town held him the way a good knot holds. Firm, simple, no show, all function. And when the internet's noise rose again, he let it pass like wind around a rock, because the mystery had given up its last secret. He was not missing anymore. He was simply himself.